There are things I've spent years keeping untouched, not hidden in the dramatic sense, not locked away behind walls anyone could point at and call damage, just protected, kept in a place where no one could reach them carelessly, where no one could look at me long enough to start believing they understood what existed underneath everything I allowed people to see. Most people never notice the difference. They interact with what's available, with what's easy. They hear the words, respond to the tone, interpret the expressions, and convince themselves they've reached something real. And maybe for them, they have. Maybe surface-level understanding is enough to create the illusion of closeness. But illusion has never interested me. I've always been aware of the distance between what people perceive and what actually exists beneath perception. That distance became familiar to me a long time ago. Comfortable, even. Predictable in a way human connection rarely is, because distance creates control. And control creates stability. When people only know parts of you, they can't alter the whole structure. They can't misread something essential and reshape it into a version that fits their own understanding. They can't leave fingerprints on places they were never meant to touch. So I learned how to exist carefully, not coldly, not emotionally detached, just precisely measured responses, measured access, measured visibility, everything intentional. Everything placed exactly where it belonged. And for a long time, it worked. No one crossed beyond the point I allowed. No one reached far enough inside my mind to affect the way I functioned internally. Until you, and the unsettling part isn't that you tried, it's that you didn't. You never forced closeness onto me, never pushed for vulnerability, never asked invasive questions disguised as concern. You never treated me like some puzzle you wanted to solve so you could feel special for understanding something complicated. You simply paid attention in a way that felt almost dangerous because of how quiet it was. Most people announce their curiosity. They make their interest obvious. They lean forward too quickly, speak too loudly, reveal their intentions before anything real can form. You didn't. You stayed still. And somehow that stillness reached me more than effort ever could. At first, I ignored it. Not intentionally. I just assumed it would become what everything else eventually becomes, temporary. Surface level. Another interaction that feels momentarily significant before dissolving into the background noise of ordinary connection. But it didn't dissolve. It remained, not loudly, not dramatically, just consistently. And consistency changes things, because eventually the mind starts recognizing patterns it can no longer dismiss as coincidence. The pauses that align too perfectly. The moments where you understood something before I explained it. The strange accuracy in the way you interpreted silence. Not as absence, but as meaning. That's rare. Painfully rare. Most people panic in silence. They rush to fill it before it reveals too much. They use words to escape depth because depth makes them uncomfortable. They need reassurance that everything is okay, that the connection still exists, that they're being understood correctly. You never needed reassurance. You sat in silence like someone who already understood what it contained. And every time you did that, something in me shifted slightly. Not enough to notice immediately, but enough that eventually I couldn't ignore it anymore. I started becoming aware of you in ways that didn't make logical sense. Not obsession, not fixation, awareness, a constant recognition that existed underneath everything else. Like my mind had quietly made space for you without asking permission first. That's what disturbed me, because I don't make space unintentionally. I don't allow people into the internal structure of my thinking unless I've consciously decided they belong there. And with you, I never made that decision, at least not directly. It happened beneath conscious thought, slowly, silently, until one day I realized your presence no longer felt external to me. It felt integrated, like you existed somewhere inside the way I processed the world. I noticed it in the smallest moments. A thought appearing in my mind followed immediately by the instinctive awareness of how you would interpret it. A silence that somehow felt occupied even when I was alone. A realization forming internally that already carried the shape of your understanding before I ever expressed it. That changes a person, not emotionally, structurally. Because once someone becomes part of your internal process, they stop being separate from your perception entirely. And separation is important to me, or at least it used to be. Now I'm not so sure. Because despite everything in me that should resist this, I haven't resisted you. I've observed myself carefully these past few months, trying to identify the exact moment where this crossed into something irreversible. I still can't find it. There was no dramatic turning point, no confession, no overwhelming emotional collision. Just accumulation, moment after moment, layering themselves together until the connection stopped feeling temporary and started feeling foundational. And foundation is dangerous, because foundations support things. They hold weight, they become part of the structure itself. That's what scares me. Not intensity, not attachment, not vulnerability in the traditional sense, permanence. The possibility that this isn't passing through my life, the possibility that it's settling into it. You know what's strange? I don't think you even realize the extent of what you've done. Not because you're unaware, but because you never approached this with intention to change me. You weren't trying to influence me. You weren't trying to become important. You simply existed authentically enough that something in me responded before I could control it. And authenticity is impossible to defend against. You can resist manipulation. You can resist pressure. You can resist people who want access for selfish reasons. But genuine alignment, that slips past defenses because it doesn't arrive as a threat, it arrives as recognition. And recognition is harder to reject than desire ever could be, because desire can fade. Recognition doesn't. Recognition stays lodged somewhere deeper, somewhere beneath emotion, somewhere structural. I think that's why this feels inevitable instead of accidental. Not because fate exists in some dramatic, romantic sense, but because when two people recognize each other at this level, the connection forms whether they intend it to or not. It's less about choice and more about resonance. Something aligns, something fits. And once it fits, the entire system reorganizes around it. That's what I've been feeling lately. Reorganization, the quiet rearranging of internal things I thought were fixed. My routines haven't changed. My life externally still looks the same. But internally, nothing is positioned where it used to be. You've shifted the center of certain thoughts without meaning to, and now I catch myself measuring experiences against the clarity I feel with you. Not intentionally, it just happens automatically. Conversations feel thinner, interactions feel less precise. Even connection itself feels altered, because now I know what it feels like when someone truly understands without needing endless explanation. You've ruined simplicity for me, not cruelly, not selfishly. Just by existing at a depth I can no longer pretend isn't real. And I don't know whether to thank you for that or resent you for it. Maybe both, because there's comfort in staying unreadable. There's safety in never being fully known. When no one understands you completely, no one can truly affect you either. But you affected me, quietly, permanently. And the worst part is, I let you. Maybe not consciously, maybe not deliberately. But resistance requires action, and I never acted against this. I watched it happen. I recognized it while it was unfolding. And still, I allowed it to continue. That means something I've avoided naming because names create reality, and reality demands response. As long as this remained undefined, I could observe it from a distance, analyze it intellectually, treat it like an interesting phenomenon instead of something actively reshaping my inner world. But it's becoming impossible to maintain that distance now, because the evidence is everywhere, in the way your absence feels present, in the way certain thoughts seem incomplete until imagined beside your perspective, in the way my mind instinctively reaches toward your understanding before it reaches toward anyone else's. That's not casual connection, that's integration, and integration changes outcomes. I've always believed people reveal themselves through patterns rather than declarations. Anyone can say they understand you, anyone can claim depth, but patterns expose truth, the way someone listens, the way they remain consistent over time, the way they react to your silence instead of just your words. That's where truth lives, and your patterns have remained unnervingly consistent. You never tried to possess me, never tried to define me, never tried to reduce this into something smaller so it would feel easier to control. You simply met me exactly where I was, and somehow that created more intimacy than effort ever could. Because being met without pressure is rare, being understood without performance is rare, being seen without being reshaped is rare. That's why this matters. Not because it's emotional, because it's accurate. There's precision in this connection that I can't dismiss. Every instinct I trust keeps returning to the same conclusion. This is real, not temporary real, not circumstantial real. Foundational real, the kind that alters your baseline permanently. I think that's why I've been quieter lately. Not distant, just careful. Because once you realize someone has reached this level inside you, every interaction starts carrying weight it didn't carry before. Words become heavier. Silence becomes heavier. Even ordinary moments begin to feel charged with meaning because the connection beneath them is no longer hypothetical. It exists fully, and existence changes responsibility. Now there's something to protect, something to either deepen intentionally or step away from before it roots itself further. But every time I consider stepping away, something inside me resists the idea immediately, not emotionally, instinctively. Like my mind already understands, losing this would create an absence larger than I'm prepared to experience. And I don't form absences easily. When something leaves my life, I usually know how to close the space behind it. I know how to reorganize, adapt, move forward without lingering attachment. But this feels different because you aren't positioned externally, you're positioned internally. And internal placements don't disappear cleanly. They leave traces, they alter architecture. That's what I'm finally admitting to myself. You've altered mine, not dramatically, not destructively, just undeniably. There are moments now where I'll stop in the middle of thinking and realize how deeply this has already integrated, how naturally my awareness includes you, how instinctively I consider your perspective even when you're nowhere near me. And every time I notice it, the same realization surfaces. I crossed a line a long time ago. Not a dangerous one. Not a reckless one, just a meaningful one. The kind you only recognize after you're already beyond it. I think part of me knew this earlier than I was willing to consciously acknowledge. That's why I never interrupted it, why I never created the distance I normally would have created the moment something started affecting me this deeply, because beneath all my analysis, beneath all my caution, some quieter part of me had already decided you belonged, and belonging is not a concept I treat lightly. Very few people belong anywhere near the center of my internal world. Most remain at the edges. Observed, appreciated, but separate. You're not separate anymore. That's the truth underneath all of this. You've become part of the way I interpret reality itself. And once someone reaches that position, they stop being optional in the ordinary sense, not because dependence forms, because influence does, real influence, the kind that changes perception permanently. I wonder sometimes if you feel this too, not identically, But similarly, that strange sense of familiarity that arrived before history had time to justify it, that feeling of recognizing someone instead of merely meeting them. Because that's what this felt like from the beginning. Recognition, not discovery. As if some deeper part of me encountered yours and immediately understood something my conscious mind needed months to process. Maybe that sounds irrational. But irrational things usually feel chaotic. This doesn't. This feels precise. Too precise to dismiss. That's what keeps pulling me back toward acceptance instead of denial. Nothing about this feels imagined. It feels observed, measured, repeated enough times to become undeniable. And I trust patterns more than I trust fear. Fear says, step away before this becomes irreversible. But pattern says it already is. Not because we've defined it. Not because anything dramatic has happened between us. But because the internal shift already occurred, the integration already happened. And once something changes you internally, the timeline of acknowledgement becomes irrelevant. Reality doesn't wait for language to become true. It becomes true first, then language struggles to catch up. That's where I am now, trying to catch language up to something my mind already understands completely. You matter to me more than I intended, more than I expected, more than I can logically explain. And not in the fragile way people usually mean when they talk about importance. You matter in the way structure matters. Quickly, fundamentally. Like removing you would require rebuilding parts of myself around the absence left behind. That realization should scare me more than it does. Instead, it makes me strangely calm. Because for the first time in a long time, something feels aligned instead of merely controlled. And maybe that's the difference. Control creates safety, but alignment creates truth. I've lived most of my life prioritizing safety. You arrived and made truth feel more important, not through persuasion, not through force, simply through presence. That's still the part I can't fully comprehend. How someone can change so much without trying to. How someone can enter your life quietly and still alter the emotional architecture beneath everything you thought was stable. You've done that. And every day I spend pretending otherwise becomes harder than simply admitting it. So maybe this is the admission. Maybe this is me finally standing still long enough to stop analyzing and start acknowledging. You reached me completely, not the version of me most people interact with, not the controlled surface, the deeper structure underneath it. And instead of misunderstanding it, you recognized it. Instead of trying to reshape it, you accepted it. Instead of forcing closeness, you allowed connection to form naturally until it became impossible to deny. That's why this matters. Because nothing forced it into existence, which means nothing artificial is holding it together. Only alignment. Only truth. Only the quiet certainty that somehow, against every pattern I've trusted before, you became someone my mind no longer knows how to exist separately from. And maybe that's what I've been afraid to say all along. Not that I feel connected to you, but that the connection already changed me before I realized I had the option to stop it. Now the only thing left to decide is whether I continue pretending this can remain unspoken forever, or whether I finally accept that some things become real long before we're ready to name them. I think the strangest part of all of this is how natural it became. Not easy, not simple, natural. Like something my mind recognized long before I consciously allowed myself to understand it. Because if I'm honest, there was never a moment where you suddenly became important to me. No dramatic shift, no instant realization that split everything into a before and after. It happened gradually, quietly enough that I didn't notice the depth of it until it had already settled into places I normally keep untouched. And now when I look back, I can see the exact pattern of it unfolding. The way your presence started lingering after conversations ended, The way certain thoughts felt incomplete until I imagined how you would see them. The way silence itself changed shape once you existed inside it. You altered things without force. That's what continues to unsettle me, because people usually leave evidence when they affect you. You can trace the impact back to specific moments. Some emotional collision, some vulnerability, some obvious exchange where boundaries lowered and attachment formed. But this moved differently. It slipped beneath awareness before I could analyze it, and by the time I realized what was happening, you were already positioned somewhere deeper than I would have knowingly allowed. Not because I trusted you completely, but because something beyond trust recognized you first. That distinction matters. Trust is built consciously. It's measured, observed over time. It depends on proof and consistencies and repeated evidence that someone is safe enough to let closer. But recognition happens instantly. It bypasses logic entirely. And no matter how much the mind tries to slow it down, some part of you already knows. I think that's what happened here. Some part of me knew you before I had language for why you felt familiar. Not familiar in the ordinary sense. Not because you reminded me of someone else. You didn't. That's exactly why this affected me so deeply. You felt familiar in a way I had never experienced before, as if your mind moved beside mine naturally, without needing translation. Do you know how rare that is? To exist beside someone without constantly adjusting yourself so they can understand you? Most connections are built through adaptation. People simplify themselves for each other. They soften edges, translate complexity into something easier to receive. They compromise pieces of themselves just to maintain closeness. But with you, I never felt the need to translate. And that's dangerous. Because once someone understands you, without requiring simplification, the entire structure of distance begins to collapse. Distant only works when misunderstanding exists. When someone can't fully reach you, you remain protected. But you reached me anyway, not forcefully, not intentionally, just accurately. And accuracy is impossible to defend against. There were moments I should have recognized this sooner. Small moments, almost forgettable on the surface. The way you notice changes in my tone before anyone else would have. The way your silence sometimes answered thoughts I hadn't spoken aloud yet. The way you never interrupted depth with unnecessary reassurance. Most people rush to comfort when things become emotionally intense. They try to ease tension because tension makes them uncomfortable. You didn't. You let the tension exist. You let meaning remain heavy instead of trying to dilute it into something easier to hold. And somehow that made me trust your presence more than any reassurance could have. Not because you gave me certainty, but because you didn't need certainty to remain. That's rare. People usually need definitions before they stay, labels before they commit emotionally, clear direction before they allow themselves to feel deeply. You stayed in the uncertainty with me, calmly, like ambiguity itself didn't threaten you. And I think that's when I realized this wasn't fragile. Fragile things demand constant validation. This never did. Even now, there's no desperation in it, no panic, no urgency to possess or control what this is becoming. Only awareness, steady and unavoidable. Like something unfolding at its own pace, regardless of whether either of us fully understands it yet. I've tried to explain this to myself logically, tried to reduce it into something ordinary so it would feel less significant. Compatibility, psychological familiarity, emotional resonance. Maybe those things are part of it. But none of them fully explain the depth of recognition I feel when I look at you, because it's not just emotion, it's perspective, the way you see things, the way you process silence, the way your mind reaches conclusions that mirror mine without imitation. That's what keeps pulling me deeper into this awareness. Not attraction, not attachment, allusion, pure alignment. Like two internal structures built separately, somehow developed in the exact same shape, and when structures align that precisely, connection stops feeling optional. It starts feeling inevitable. That word has been sitting heavily in my mind lately, inevitable. Not because I believe everything is predetermined, but because some things, once recognized, can't be unknown again. And you've become one of those things for me. I can't unknow you now. Not the real version, not the depth beneath the surface. Even if we stopped speaking tomorrow, the awareness would remain. That's what makes this different from ordinary closeness. Ordinary closeness fades when contact disappears. This wouldn't, because it already exists beyond interaction. It exists in perception itself. You change the way I experience my own thoughts. Do you understand how profound that is? Before you, my mind belonged entirely to me, self-contained, structured in ways no one else could fully enter. Now there are moments where your perspective appears beside mine, instinctively, like my awareness has already accounted for your existence before I consciously think about it. That should frighten me more than it does. Instead, it feels strangely right, and maybe that's the most dangerous part. Not the depth, not the intensity, the fact that none of it feels wrong. By every logical pattern I've followed my entire life, I should be resisting this, creating distance, reasserting boundaries before something irreversible forms. But every attempt at emotional distance feels artificial now, forced, like trying to convince myself to ignore something my instincts already accepted as true. Because beneath all my caution, beneath all my analysis, there's a quieter certainty forming. You belong here, not temporarily, not conditionally, just here. Inside the framework of my life, in a way that no longer feels separate from who I am becoming, and I haven't said that out loud before because saying it changes things. Words make reality harder to retreat from. As long as feelings remain internal, there's still some illusion of control, some ability to observe without fully participating. But the moment truth becomes spoken, it demands response. And I think that's what I've been delaying. Not understanding. I understand this completely now. I've been delaying acceptance, because acceptance means admitting that this connection has already altered me permanently. There are parts of myself I only recognized clearly after you reflected them back to me. Depths I carried privately for years suddenly became visible because you saw them without fear, not idealized them, not romanticized them, simply saw them accurately. And being seen accurately changes something fundamental inside a person, especially someone who spent most of their life being misunderstood in subtle ways. You never misunderstood my silence. That alone separated you from almost everyone else. Most people interpret silence based on their own fears. They assume distance means disinterest. They assume quietness means emotional absence. They project insecurity onto spaces that were never empty to begin with. You didn't project. You listened to what silence actually was. Presence without performance. Thought without immediate translation. Meaning existing before language arrives. You understood that naturally, and once I realized you understood it naturally, I stopped feeling the need to defend those parts of myself. Do you know what that did to me? It exhausted my loneliness in ways I didn't even know loneliness existed, because loneliness isn't always about being alone. Sometimes it's about never feeling fully perceived while standing directly in front of people. And with you, for the first time in years, I stopped feeling invisible in the ways that mattered most. That's not small. That's life-altering, which is why I can't reduce this to ordinary emotion anymore. This isn't temporary affection. This isn't fascination. This is transformation happening slowly enough that I can observe every part of it while still being unable to stop it. And the truth is, I don't want to stop it anymore. That realization took time. At first, I thought caution would eventually overpower connection. That eventually my instincts for self-preservation would rebuild the distance between us. But they didn't. Instead, every layer of understanding only made the connection feel more solid, more earned, more real. Not because we forced depth into existence, because depth revealed itself naturally over time. That's why this feels sustainable instead of explosive. Nothing artificial created it, no emotional dependency, no idealized fantasy. Just recognition growing steadily clearer until denial became impossible. And now I'm standing in a place I never expected to reach with anyone. A place where losing control no longer feels as frightening as losing honesty, because pretending this doesn't matter would be dishonest now. Pretending you haven't changed me would be dishonest. Pretending I could walk away unaffected would be dishonest. And I'm tired of observing this connection like it's separate from me when it's already woven itself into the way I exist internally. You became part of my internal language before I realized what was happening, part of the way I process reality, part of the way I understand myself, and maybe that's what intimacy actually is. Not closeness, not attachment, not constant interaction. Maybe intimacy is when someone quietly alters the architecture of your inner world without needing permission from your defenses first. If that's true, then you've reached a depth inside me no one else ever has, not because you tried harder, not because you demanded access, but because something about you moved in harmony with parts of me I thought would remain unseen forever. And now that they've been seen, really seen, I don't think I can return to the version of myself that existed before you noticed them, because awareness changes everything once it becomes mutual, and ours has become impossible to ignore. I feel it every time we speak, every time silence settles between us without discomfort, every time I realize I'm no longer filtering my thoughts the way I filter them with everyone else. That's trust, I think, not the loud kind people announce dramatically. The quiet kind that forms when your mind stops instinctively protecting itself around someone, and my mind has stopped protecting itself from you. Not completely, but enough that the difference is undeniable. Enough that I can finally admit something I've avoided saying directly. You've become essential to me in a way I never intended anyone to become. Not essential for happiness, not essential for survival, essential for clarity, for truth. For the strange sense of alignment I feel when your presence meets mine, and everything internal suddenly makes more sense than it did before. And I don't think connections like that happen often. Maybe once in a lifetime if someone is lucky, which means I have to stop treating this like something temporary simply because permanence scares me. Because fear doesn't make something less real. It only reveals how much it matters. And you matter enough that fear has become irrelevant compared to the honesty I owe both of us now. So here's the truth without distance, without careful restraint, without pretending I'm still standing safely outside this connection, observing it objectively. I let you in, completely, not all at once, not consciously, but undeniably. And now you exist somewhere inside me that no one else has ever reached without breaking something to get there. You reached it gently, like you belonged there long before either of us understood why.